Sex. The happiness of all human beings, men and women, depends largely on their rational solution of the sexual problem. Sex and the part it plays in human life cannot be ignored. In the case of animals, sex plays a simpler and less complex role. It is a purely natural and instinctive function whose underlying purpose is the perpetuation of the species. It is not complicated by the many incidental phenomena which result, in man's case, from psychological, economic, moral, and religious causes. Climate, social conditions, individual modes of life and work, alcohol, wealth and poverty, and other factors affect sexual activity in human beings. Sexual love, which is practically unknown to the animals, is a special development of the sex urge in the human soul. The deeper purpose of the sex function in human beings, likewise, is procreation, the reproduction of species. The average man, woman, and child should know the essential sex facts in order to be able to deal with the sex problems of life. Of late years, there has been a greater diffusion of such knowledge. To a large extent, however, children and adolescents are still taught to look on all that pertains to sex as something shameful and immodest, something not to be discussed. Sex is an avoided subject. This is fundamentally wrong. Sex affects the very root of all human life. Its activities are not obscene, but nature's own means to certain legitimate ends. The sex functions, when properly controlled and led into the proper channels, are a most essential and legitimate form of physical self-expression. The veil of secrecy with which they are so often shrouded tends to create an altogether false impression regarding them. This discussion of these avoided subjects in plain English is intended to give the salient facts regarding sex in a direct, straightforward manner, bearing in mind the true purpose of normal sex activities. The more we know of the facts of sex, the right and normal part sex activities play in life, and all that tends to abuse and degrade them, the better able we will be to make sex a factor for happiness in our own lives and that of our descendants. Mankind, for its own general good, must desire that reproduction, the real purpose of every sexual function, occur in such a way as to perpetuate its own best physical and mental qualities. The law of physical life. It is a universal rule of physical life that every individual being undergoes a development which we know as its individual life and which, so far as its physical substance is concerned, ends with death. Death is the destruction of the greater part of this individual organism, which, when death ensues, once more becomes lifeless matter. Only small portions of this matter, the germ cells, continue to live under certain conditions which nature has fixed. The germ cell, as has been established by the microscope, is the tiny cell which in the lowest living organisms as well as in man himself forms the unit of physical development. Yet, even this tiny cell is already a highly organized and perfected thing. It is composed of the most widely differing elements which, taken together, form the so-called protoplasm or cellular substance. And for all life established in nature, the cell remains the constant and unchanging form element. It comprises the cell protoplasm and a nucleus embedded in it, whose substance is known as the nucleoplasm. The nucleus is the more important of the two and, so to say, governs the life of the cell protoplasm. The lower one-celled organisms in nature increase by division, just as do the individual cells of a more highly organized, many-celled order of living beings. And in all cases, though death or destruction of the cells is synonymous with the death or destruction of the living organism, the latter, in most cases, already has recreated itself by reproduction. We will not go into the very complicated details of the actual process of the growth and division of the protoplasmic cells. It is enough to say that in the case of living creatures provided with more complicated organisms, such as the higher plants, animals, and man, the little cell units divide and grow as they do in the case of the lower organism. The fact is one which shows the intimate interrelationship of all living beings. The ladder of organic ascent. As we mount the ascending ladder of plant and animal life, the unit cell of the lower organisms is replaced by a great number of individual cells which have grown together to form a completed whole. In this complete whole, the cells, in accordance with the specific purpose for which they are intended, all have a different form and a different chemical composition. Thus it is that in the case of the plants, leaves, flowers, buds, bark, branches, and stems are formed, and in that of animals, skin, intestines, glands, blood, muscles, nerves, brain, and the organs of sense. In spite of the complicated nature of numerous organisms, we find that many of them still possess the power of reproducing themselves by division or a process of budding. In the case of certain plants and animals, cell groups grow together into a so-called bud, which later detaches itself from the parent body and forms a new individual living organism, as in the case of the polyps or the tubers in plant life. A tree, for instance, may be grown from a graft which has been cut off and planted in the ground, and ants and bees which have not been fecundated are quite capable of laying eggs out of which develop perfect, well-formed descendants. This last process is called Parthenogenesis. It is a process, however, which, if carried on through several generations, ends in deterioration and degeneracy. In the case of higher animals, vertebrates, and man, such reproduction is an impossibility. These higher types of animal life have been provided by nature with special organs of reproduction and reproductive glands whose secretions, when they are projected from the body under certain conditions, reproduce themselves and increase and develop in such wise that the living organism from which they proceed is reproduced in practically its identical form. Thus, it perpetuates the original type. Philosophically, it may be said that these cells directly continue the life of the parents, so that death in reality only destroys a part of the individual. Every individual lives again in his offspring. The true mission of sex. This rebirth of the individual in his descendants represents the true mission of sex where the human being is concerned, and reproduction, the perpetuation of the species, underlies all rightful and normal sex functions and activities. The actual physical process of reproduction, the details which initiate reproduction in the case of the human being, it seems unnecessary here to describe. In the animal world, into which the moral equation does not really enter, the facts of conjugation represent a simple and natural working out of functional bodily laws, usually with a seasonal determination. But where man is concerned, these facts are so largely made to serve the purpose of pruriency, so exploited to inflame the imagination in an undesirable and directly harmful way, that they can be approached only with the utmost caution. The intimate fact or knowledge necessary in this connection is of a peculiarly personal and sacred nature, and represents information which is better communicated by the spoken than by the printed word. The wise father and mother are those naturally indicated to convey this information to their sons and daughters by word of mouth. By analogy, by fuller development and description of the reproductive process of plant and animal life on which we have touched, the matter of human procreation may be approached. Parents should stress the point, when trying to present this subject to the youthful mind, that man's special function are only a detail, albeit a most important one, in nature's vast plan for the propagation of life on earth. This will have the advantage of correcting a trend on the part of the imaginative boy or girl to lay too much stress on the part humanity plays in the great general reproductive scheme. It will lay weight on the fact that the functional workings of reproduction are not primarily a source of pleasure, but that when safeguarded by the institution of matrimony on which civilized social life is based, they stand for the observance of solemn duties and obligations, duties to church and state, and obligations to posterity. Hence, parents, in talking to their children about these matters, should do so in a sober and instructive fashion. The attention of a mother, perhaps, need not be called to this, but fathers may be inclined in many cases to inform their sons without insisting that the information they give them is, in the final analysis, intended to apply to lofty constructive purposes. They may, in their desire to speak practically, forget the moral values which should underlie this intimate information. Never should the spirit of levity intrude itself in these intimate personal sex colloquies. Restraint and decency should always mark them. In making clear to the mind of youth the data which initiates and governs reproduction in animals and in human life, the ideal to be cultivated is continence, the refraining from all experimentation undertaken in a spirit of curiosity, until such time as a well-placed affection, sanctioned by the divine blessing, will justify a sane and normal exploitation of physical needs and urges in the matrimonial state. To this end, hard bodily and mental work should be encouraged in the youth of both sexes. Satan finds work for idle hands to do as special application in this connection, and a chaste and continent youth is usually the forerunner of a happy and contented marriage. And incidentally, a happy marriage is the best guarantee that reproduction, the carrying on of the species, will be morally and physically a success. Here too the fact should be strongly stressed that prostitution cannot be justified on any moral grounds. It represents a deliberate ignoring of the rightful function of sex and the perversion of the sane and natural laws of reproduction. It is in marriage, in the sane and normal activities of that unit of our whole social system, the family, that reproduction develops nature's basic principle of perpetuation in the highest and worthiest manner, in obedience to laws humane and divine. Sex in the marriage relation, the husband. Marriage is the process by which a man and woman enter into a complete physical, legal, and moral union. The natural object of marriage is the complete community of life for the establishment of a family. The marriageable age and adaptation. At 24, the male body attains its complete development, and 25 is a proper age for the young man to marry. Romantic love, personal affection on a basis of congeniality, mutual adaptation, a similar social sphere of life should determine his choice. Nature and custom indicate that the husband should be somewhat older than the wife. Men who should not marry. Men suffering with diseases which may be communicated by contagion or heredity should not marry. These diseases include tuberculosis, syphilis, cancer, leprosy, epilepsy, and some nervous disorders, some skin diseases, and insanity. A worn-out rake has no business to marry, since marriage is not a hospital for the treatment of disease or a reformatory institution for moral lepers. Those having a marked tendency to disease must not marry those of similar tendency. The marriage of cousins is not to be advocated. The blood relation tends to bring together persons with similar morbid tendencies. Where both are healthy, however, there seems to be no special liability to mental incompetency, though such marriages are accused of producing defective or idiot children. Men suffering from congenital defects should not marry. Natural blindness, deafness, muteness, and congenital deformities of limb are more or less likely to be passed on to their children. There are cases of natural blindness, though, to which this rule does not apply. Criminals, alcoholics, and persons disproportionate in size should not marry. In the last mentioned, lack of mutual physical adaptability may produce much unhappiness, especially on the part of the wife. Serious local disease, sterility, and great risk in childbirth may result. Disparity of years, disparity of race, a poverty which will not permit the proper raising of children, undesirable moral character are all good reasons for not marrying. Medical examination before marriage. Medical examination as a preliminary to marriage is practically more valuable than a marriage license. Since many entirely innocent young girls today suffer from disease incurred either through hereditary or accidental infection, a would-be husband may be said to be quite as much entitled to protection as his bride-to-be. Prohibitive physical defects are also discovered in this connection. Love and sex. When we take under consideration the higher, truer love of one sex for the other, that is, an affection which is not simply a friendship, but has a sex basis, we realize that it may be a very noble emotion. There is no matter of doubt but that the normal human being feels a great need for love. Sex in love and its manifestation in the life of the soul is one of the first conditions of human happiness and a main aim of human existence. All know the tale of Cupid's arrow. A man falls in love with a face, a pair of eyes, the sound of a voice, and his affection is developed from this trifling beginning until it takes complete possession of him. This love is usually made up of two components, a sex instinct and feelings of sympathy and interest which hark back to primal times. And this love, in its true sense, should stand for an affection purified from egoism. When, among the lower animal forms, we find individuals without a determined sex, egoism develops free from all restraint. Each individual creature devours as much as it can, and feeding, together with propagation by division, budding, or conjunction, makes up the total of its vital activities. It needs do no more to accomplish the purpose of its existence. Even when propagation commences to take place by means of individual male and female parents, the same principle of egoism largely obtains. The spiders are typical instances of this. In their case, the carrying out of the mutual functions of the male spider is attended with much danger for him, owing to the fact that if he does not exercise the greatest care, he is apt to be devoured immediately afterward by his female partner, in order that no useful food matter may be lost. Yet, even in the case of the spiders, the female spider already gives proof of a certain capacity for sacrifice where her young are concerned, at any rate for a short time after they have crept from the egg. In animals somewhat higher in the creative scale, more or less powerful feelings of affection may develop out of their sex association. There is affection on the part of the male for his mate, and on the part of the female for her young. Often these feelings develop into a strong, lasting affection between the sexes, and years of what might be called faithful matrimonial union have been observed in the case of birds. This in itself is sufficient to establish the intimate relationship between love in a sex sense and love in a general sense. And even in the animal creation, we find the same analogy existing between these feelings of sympathy and their opposites, which occur in the case of human beings. Every feeling of attachment or sympathy existing between two individuals has a counterpart in an opposite feeling of discontent when the object of the love or attachment in question dies, falls sick, or runs away. This feeling of discontent may assume the form of a sorrow ending in lasting melancholy. In the case of apes and of certain parrots, it has been noticed that the death of a mate has frequently led the survivor to refuse nourishment and die in turn from increasing grief and depression. If, on the other hand, an animal discovers the cause of the grief or loss which threatens it, if some enemy creature tries to rob it of its mate or little ones, the mixed reactive feelings of rage or anger is born in it, anger against the originator of its discontent. Jealousy is only a definite special form of this anger reaction. A further development of the feeling of sympathy is that of duty. Every feeling of love or sympathy urges those who feel it to do certain things which will benefit the object of that love. A mother will feed her young, bed them down comfortably, caress them. A father will bring nourishment to the mother and her brood, and protect them against foes. All these actions, not performed to benefit the creature itself, but to help its beloved mate, represent exertion, trouble, the overcoming of danger, and lead to a struggle between egoism and the feeling of sympathy. Out of this struggle is born a third feeling, that of responsibility and conscience. Thus, the elements of the human social feelings are already quite pronounced in the case of many animals, including those of love as well as sex. In the human animal, speaking in general, these feelings of sympathy, love, and duty are strongly developed in the family connection. That is, they are developed with special strength in those who are most intimately united in sex life, in husband and wife, and in children. Consequently, the feelings of sympathy or love, which extend to larger communal groups, such as more distant family connections, the tribe, the community, those speaking the same tongue, the nation, are relatively far weaker. Weakest of all, in all probability, is that general human feeling which sees a brother in every other human being and is conscious of the social duties owed him. As regards man and wife, the relation of the actual sex instinct to love is often a very complicated one. In the case of man, the sex feeling may and frequently does exist independent of love in the higher sense. In the case of woman, it is quite certain that love occurs far less seldom unaccompanied by the sex inclination. It is also quite possible for love to develop before the development of the sex feeling, and this often in married life leads to the happiest relationships. The mutual adoration of two individuals, husband and wife, often degenerates into a species of egoistic enmity toward the remainder of the world, and this in turn, in many cases, reacts unfavorably upon the love the two feel for each other. Human solidarity, especially in this day, is already too great not to revenge itself upon the egotistical character of so exclusive a love. The real ideal of sex in love might be expressed as follows. A man and a woman should be induced to unite in marriage through genuine sex attraction and harmony of character and disposition. In this union, they should mutually encourage each other to labor socially for the common good of mankind in such wise that they further their own mutual education and that of their children, the beings nearest and dearest to them, as the natural point of departure for helping general human betterment. If love, in its relation to sex, be conceived in this manner, it will purify it by doing away with its pettinesses, and it is just into these pettinesses that the most honest and upright of matrimonial loves too often degenerate. The constructive work done in common by two human beings who, while they care lovingly for each other, at the same time encourage each other to strive and endure in carrying out the principles of right living and high thinking, will last. Love and marriage, looked at from this point of view, are relatively immune from the small jealousies and other evil little developments of a one-sided, purely physical affection. It will work for an ever more ideal realization of love in its higher and nobler dispensations. Real and true love is lasting. The suddenly awakened storm of sex affection for a hitherto totally unknown person can never be accepted as a true measure for love. This sudden surge of the sex feeling warps the judgment, makes it possible to overlook the grossest defects, covers all and everything with heavenly hues. It makes a man who is in love, or two beings who are in love, mutually blind, and causes each to carefully conceal his or her real inward self from the other. This may be the case even when the feelings of both are absolutely honest, especially if the sex feeling is not paired with cool, egoistic calculation. Not until the first storm of the sex feeling has subsided, when honeymoon weeks are over, is a more normal point of view regained. And then love, indifference, or hatred, as the case may be, develops. It is for this reason that love at first sight is always dangerous, and that only a longer and more intimate acquaintance with the object of one's affection is calculated to give a lasting union a relatively good chance of turning out happily. One thing is worth bearing in mind. Woman invariably represents the conservative element in the family. Her emotional qualities, combined with wonderful endurance, always control her intellect more powerfully than is the case with man, and the feelings and emotions form the conservative element in the human soul. Sex in the adolescent female, from puberty to maturity. Adolescence in the girl is the period when she develops into a woman. It is that stage in female life embraced between the ages of 12 or 14 and 21 years. Elasticity of body, a clear complexion, and a happy control of her feelings should mark the young girl at this time, if she has been so fortunate as to escape the dangers and baneful influences of childhood and infancy. Her numerous bodily functions should be well performed. Thus constituted, she should be in a condition to take up her coming struggle with the world and the sex problem it will present. Puberty. It has been noticed that in the case of girls, puberty usually occurs earlier in brunettes than in blondes. In general, it makes its appearance earlier in those of a nervous or bilo-nervous temperament than in those whose temperament is phlegmatic or lymphatic. In the United States, 14 and a half years is the usual age of puberty in girls. In tropical lands, however, it is not uncommon for a girl to be a mother at 12. Country girls and boys usually mature several months or a year later than those living in cities. Too early a puberty in girls may well arouse concern. It usually indicates some inherent constitutional weakness. Premature puberty is often associated with premature decay. The signs and changes of puberty. In the girl, the sign of puberty is the growth of hair about the pubes, private organs, and armpits. Her whole frame remains more slender than in the male. Muscles and joints are less prominent, limbs more rounded and tapering. Internal and external organs undergo rapid enlargement locally. The mammae, the breasts, enlarge, the ovaries dilate, and a periodical uteral discharge, menstruation, is established. Menstruation. No young girl should feel alarmed if, owing to the negligence of her parents or guardians to prepare her, she is surprised by this first flow from the genital organs. Puberty is the proper time for the appearance of menstruation. This is the periodical development and discharge of an ovule, one or more, by the female, accompanied by the discharge of a fluid known as menses or catamenia. Menstruation, in general good health, should occur about every 28 days or once in 4 weeks. This rule, however, is subject to great variation. Menstruation continues from puberty to about the 45th year, which usually marks the menopause or change of life. When it disappears, a woman is no longer capable of bearing children. Her period of fertility has passed. In rare cases, menstruation has stopped at 35 or lasted till 30. Hints for observance during menstruation. When the period arrives, a girl or woman has a feeling of discomfort and lassitude. There is a sense of weight and a disinclination for society. Menstruation should not, however, be regarded as a nuisance. A girl's friends respect her most when she is unwell. She should keep more than usually quiet while the flow continues, which it will do for a few days. Also, she should avoid all unnecessary fatigue, exposure to wet, or to extremes of temperature. Some girls are guilty of the crime of trying to arrest the menstruation flow and resorting to methods of stopping it. Why? In order to attend a dance or pleasure excursion. Lives have been lost by thus suppressing the monthly flux. Mothers should instruct their daughters when the menses are apt to begin and what their function is. During menstruation, great care must be taken in using water internally. A chill is sufficient to arrest the flow. If menstruation does not establish itself in a healthy or normal manner at the proper time, consult a physician in order to remove this abnormal condition. Any disturbance of the delicate menstrual functions during the period by constrained positions, muscular effort, brain work, and mental or physical excitement is apt to have serious consequences. Continence and the young adolescent girl. Continence is, as a rule, more easily observed by the adolescent girl than by the adolescent youth. Ordinarily, the normal young girl has no undue sexual propensities, amorous thoughts, or feelings. Though she is exposed to the danger of meeting other girls who may be lewd in thought and speech, in the houses of friends or at school, she is not apt to be carried away by their example. Yet, even a good, pure-minded young girl may be debauched. Especially during adolescence, the easy observance of natural continence depends greatly on the proper functioning of the female genital organs. These may be easily disturbed. The syringe used for injections for so-called purposes of cleanliness is in reality a danger. The inner organs are self-cleansing. Water or other fluids cast into them disorder the mucous follicles and dry up their secretions, preventing the flowing out of some of nature's necessities. A daily washing of the inner organs for a long period with water also produces chronic leukorrhea. Why young girls fall. Lack of proper early training, abnormal sex instincts, weak good nature, poverty, all may be responsible for a young girl's moral downfall. As a general thing, right home training and home environment and sane sex education will prevent the normally good girl from going wrong. It should be remembered, though, that a naturally more gentle and yielding disposition may easily lead her into temptation. Girls who are sentimentally inclined should beware of giving way to advances on the part of young men which have only one object in view, the gratification of their animal passion. The holding of hands and similar innocent beginnings often pave the way for more familiar caresses. Passionate kisses, the promiscuous kiss, by the way, may be the carrier of that dread infection syphilis, violently awaken a young girl's sex instincts. The fact is that many innocent girls idealize their seducers. They believe their lying promises actually come to love them and think that in gratifying their inflamed desires, they are giving proof of the depth and purity of their own affection. Here, as in the case of the young man, self-control should be the first thing cultivated, and self-control should be made doubly sure by never permitting one of the opposite sex to show undue familiarity. Many a seemingly innocent flirtation begun with a kiss, has ended in shame and disgrace, in loss of social standing and position, venereal disease, or even death. The pure-minded and innocent girl often becomes a victim of her ignorance of the consequences entailed by giving in to the desires of some male companion. The girl who has a knowledge of sex facts is less apt to be taken advantage of in this manner. Modern conditions which encourage immorality. Excessive freedom. The excessive freedom granted the young girl, especially since the World War, must be held responsible for a great increase in familiarity between the adolescent youth of both sexes. Many young girls of the flapper type, in particular, are victims of these conditions of unrestrained sex association. Sex precocity is furthered in coeducational colleges, in the high school, and the home. Adolescents of both sexes, too, often are practically unhampered in their comings and goings, their words and actions. The surreptitious pocket flask filled with hooch is often a feature of social parties, dances, and affairs frequented by young people. Girls and boys drink together, and as alcohol weakens moral resistance in the one case and stimulates desire in the other, deplorable consequences naturally result. In the United States, the number of girls sent home from colleges and of high school girls being privately treated by physicians to save them from disgrace is incredibly large. Parents who do not control the social activities of their daughters, who permit them to spend their evenings away from home with only a general idea of what they are doing or whom they are meeting, need not be surprised if their morals are undermined. The advent of the automobile is responsible for an easy and convenient manner of satisfying precociously aroused sex instincts in young girls and boys. Often, unconscientious pleasure seekers roam the roads in their auto. They accost girls who are walking and offer them a lift. When the latter refuse to gratify their desires, they are often beaten and flung from the car. The daily press has given such publicity to this civilized form of headhunting that it is difficult to sympathize with girls who are thus treated. They cannot help but know that in 9 cases out of 10, a stranger who invites them to ride, who picks them up, does so with the definite purpose already mentioned in view. Poverty. Poverty, too, plays a large role in driving young girls into a life of vice. In all our large cities, there are hundreds of young women who earn hardly enough to buy food and fuel and pay for the rent of a room in a cheap lodging house. Feminine youth longs for dress, for company, for entertainment. It is easy enough to find a gentleman friend who will provide all 3 in exchange for companionship. So the bargain is struck. These conditions exist in 101 occupations. A young woman may go to a large city as pure as snow, but finding no lucrative employment, lonely and despondent, she is led to take her first step on the downward path. Soon, daily contact with vice removes abhorrence to it. Familiarity makes it habitual, and another life is ruined. The heartless moral code of the cynical young pleasure-seeking male is summed up in the cant phrase about women: find and forget. It is these girls who are victimized by their lack of self-restraint or moral principle, their ignorance or weakness, who make possible the application of such a maxim. Virginity. Both mental and physical purity are rightfully required of the young girl about to marry. How shall she acquire and maintain this desirable state of purity? The process is a simple one. She must let a knowledge of true hygienic and moral laws of her sex guide her in her relations with men. She must cultivate clean thought on a basis of physical cleanliness. She need not be ignorant to be pure. Men she should study carefully. She should not allow them to sit with their arm about her waist, to hold her hand, to kiss her. No approach nor touch beyond what the best social observance sanctions should be permitted. Even the tendernesses and familiarities of courtship should be restrained. An engagement does not necessarily culminate in a marriage, and once the foot has slipped on virtue's path, the error cannot be recalled. These considerations, together with those adduced in the preceding section, Why Young Girls Fall, are well worth taking to heart by every young woman who wishes to approach matrimony in the right and proper way. In the adolescent male, from puberty to maturity. Adolescence is the period when the boy is lost to the man. It is the time of life embraced between the ages of 14 or 16 and the age of 25. Every boy, if properly trained, should reach this period in a state of good general health and spirits. Hitherto, he has been led and guided. Now he must develop mental strength and willpower himself to choose the good and refuse the evil in the sexual problems confronting him. Puberty. According to climate puberty, the age when the human male becomes sexually perfect varies from 10 to 15 years. In the United States, puberty in the male usually occurs at the age of 14 and a half years. In tropical climates, it occurs at 9 or 10, and in cold countries such as Norway and Siberia, it may not take place until 18 or 19. Vigorous physical exercise tends to delay puberty. Anything exciting the emotions tends to hasten it. Stimulating foods, pepper, vinegar, mustard, spices, tea, and coffee, excess meat nutriment, hasten puberty. A cool, unstimulating vegetable and farinaceous diet may delay the development of the sexual system several months or a year. The signs and changes of puberty. In the boy, the signs of puberty are the growth of hair on the skin covering the pubes and in the armpits. Chest and arms broaden, the frame grows more angular, the masculine proportions more pronounced. The vocal cords grow longer and lower the pitch of the voice. Hair grows on chin, upper lip, cheeks, and often on the body surface. The sexual moral law. The sexual moral law is the same for both sexes and equally binding. It may be summed up as follows. Your sexual urges, instincts, and desires should never consciously injure an individual human being or mankind in general. They should be exercised to further the value and happiness of both. The male adolescent and continence. The perfect carrying out of this general moral law implies continence on the part of the male adolescent until marriage. Continence is positive restraint under all circumstances. Strict continence is neither injurious to health, nor does it produce impotence. While self-denial is difficult, since the promptings of nature often seem imperious, it is not impossible. It is certain that no youth will suffer physically by remaining sexually pure. The demands which occur during adolescence are mainly abnormal, due to the excitements of an overstimulating diet, pornographic literature and art, and the temptations of impure association. Why young men go wrong. Foul thoughts, once they enter the mind, corrode it. The sensual glance, the bawdy laugh, the ribald jest, the smutty story, the obscene song may be met with on street corner, in the car, train, hotel lobby, lecture hall, and workshop. Mental unchastity ends in physical unchastity. The habit common to most adolescent boys and young men of relating smutty stories, repeating foul jokes, and making indecent allusions destroys respect for virtue. In addition, there are such direct physical causes of undue adolescent sexual excitement as constipation and alcoholism, and such mental ones as nervous irritability. To the constant discussion and speculation regarding sex and its mysteries by the adolescent young male must be added the artificial idea that idle prattling on the subject is a sign of manhood. Thus, many young men, whose natural trend is in the direction of decency and right sexual living, step out or go to see the girls, as the phrase is, because they think that otherwise they are not real men. More subtle in its evil effect, yet somewhat less dangerous physically perhaps than the professional prostitute, is the lure of the hidden prostitute, who carefully conceals her derelictions and publicly wraps herself in the mantle of virtue. Prostitution. The training of the average male mind in impure language and thought during boyhood and adolescence, the cultivation of his animal at the expense of the moral nature, often leads the adolescent to seek satisfaction by frequenting the prostitute. Prostitution, known as the social evil, is promiscuous unchastity for gain. It has existed in all civilized countries from earliest times. Prostitution abuses the instinct for reproduction, the basic element of sex, to offer certain women a livelihood which they prefer to other means. Love of excitement, inherited criminal propensities, indolence, and abnormal sex appetite are first causes of prostitution. Difficulty in finding work, laborious and ill-paid work, harsh treatment of girls at home, indecent living among the poor, contact with demoralizing companions, loose literature, and amusements are secondary causes. They all constitute to debauch male and female youth and lead it to form dangerous habits of vicious sensual indulgence. Prostitution seems inseparable from human society in large communities. The fact is acknowledged in the name given it, the necessary evil. Regulation and medical control only arrest to a degree the spread of venereal diseases to which prostitution gives rise. The elementary laws on which prostitution rests seem to be stronger than the artificial codes imposed by moral teaching. It is an evil which must be combated individually. Men are principally responsible, in one way or another, for the existence of the social evil. In the case of the young man, abstinence is the only cure for the probable results of indulging his animal passions by recourse to the prostitute. Prostitution, both public and private, is the most dangerous menace to society at large. It is the curse of individual young manhood because of the venereal diseases it spreads. One visit to a house of prostitution may ruin a young man's health and life, and millions of human beings die annually from the effects of poison contracted in these houses. Wild oats sown in company with the prostitute usually bear fruit in the shape of the most loathsome and destructive sex disorders. The development of self-control, the avoidance of impure thoughts and associations, the cultivation of the higher moral nature instead of the lower animal one, and finally, marriage, should prevent the young man from falling into prostitution. All the state and medical regulation in the world will not protect him from the venereal diseases he is so apt to acquire by such indulgence. Free love. Free love is the doctrine of unrestrained choice without binding ties in sexual relations. For altogether different reasons, however, it is quite as objectionable as prostitution for the young man. It may offer better hygienic guarantees, but it is a sexual partnership which is opposed to the fundamental institution of marriage on which society in general is based throughout the world. And aside from the fact that it is a promiscuous relationship not sanctioned by law or society, it is seldom practically successful. It cannot admit of true love without bitter jealousies. Sex diseases. The sex diseases are the same in both sexes, whether developed by direct or accidental infection. They are the greatest practical argument in favor of continence, morality, and marriage in the sex relation. Gonorrhea. Gonorrhea is a pus-discharging inflammation of the canal known as the urethra, which, passing through the entire length of the organ, carries both the urine and the seminal fluid. It is caused by a venereal bacillus, the gonococcus. Under favorable conditions and with right treatment, gonorrhea may be cured, though violently painful, in 14 days. Often the inflammation extends, becomes chronic, and attacks other organs. This chronic gonorrhea often causes permanent contraction of the urethra, which leads to the painful retention of urine, catarrh of the bladder, and stone. Chronic gonorrhea, too, often ends in death, especially if the kidneys are attacked. A cured case of gonorrhea does not mean immunity from further attacks. New infections are all the more easily acquired. Gonorrhea has even more dangerous consequences in women than in men. The gonococcus bacilli infect all the inner female genital organs. They cause frequent inflammations and lead to growths in the belly. Women thus attacked are apt to be sterile. They suffer agonies and often become chronic invalids. The child born of a gonorrheal mother, while passing through the infected genital organs, comes to life with infected eyelids. This is blennorrhea, which may result in total blindness. Gonorrhea also causes inflammation of the joints, gonorrheal rheumatism, testicular inflammations which may lead to sterility. Some authorities claim that fully half of the sterility in women is caused by gonorrheal infection of the fallopian tubes. Gonorrheal infection of the eyes at birth is now prevented by first washing them in a saturated solution of boric acid, then treating them with a drop of weak silver solution. Syphilis. Syphilis is a still more terrible venereal disease. It usually appears first in small, hard sores, hard cankers, on the sexual parts or the mouth. Then the syphilitic poison spreads throughout the whole body by means of the blood. After a few weeks, it breaks out on the face or body. Its final cure is always questionable. Syphilis may lie dormant for years and then suddenly become active again. It breaks out in sores on all parts of the body, often eats up the bone, destroys internal organs such as the liver, causes hardening of the lungs, diseases of the blood vessels, and eye diseases. Ulcers of the brain and nerve paralysis often result from it. One of its most terrible consequences is consumption of the spinal marrow and paralysis of the brain, or paresis. The first slowly hardens and destroys the spinal marrow, the second the brain. These diseases are only developed by previous syphilitics. As a rule, they occur from 5 to 20 years after infection, usually 10 or 15 years after it, and they usually happen to persons who believed themselves completely cured. Consumption of the spinal marrow leads to death in the course of a few years of continual torture. Paralysis of the brain turns the sufferer into a human ruin, gradually extinguishing all mental and nervous functions, sentience, movement, speech, and intellect. One danger of syphilis is the fact that its true nature may be overlooked during the first period because of the lack of pronounced symptoms. Its early sores may easily be mistaken for some skin affection. Mercury and other means are successful in doing away with at least the more noticeable signs of syphilis during the first and secondary stages. The modern medical treatment using mercury and salvarsan, 606 in alteration, has been very successful. It is claimed that by following it, syphilis may be totally cured if taken in hand during the first stage. The sores developed during the first 2 or 3 years of the disease are very infectious. In the case of chronic syphilis of 3 or 4 years standing, the sores as a rule are no longer infectious. It is possible possible, however, for a syphilitic of this description to bring forth syphilitic children without infecting his wife. Such children either die at birth or later of this congenital syphilis. They may also die of spinal consumption or paresis between the ages of 10 and 20. The mortality of all syphilitic children is very great. In most cases, however, healthy children are born of the wedlock of relatively cured syphilitics, though they are often sterile. Young men who have had recourse to prostitutes often inoculate their wives with gonorrhea or syphilis, and thus the plague is spread. The soft canker. The soft canker is the third form of venereal disease, the hard canker being the first stage of syphilis. It is the least dangerous of the venereal diseases, but unfortunately, relatively the one which occurs most seldom. When not complicated with syphilis, it appears locally. It is a larger or smaller sore feeding and growing on the genital organs. Venereal disease, an advocate of continence. The most tragic consequence of all venereal disease is the part it plays in the infection of innocent children and innocent wives and mothers. Often a pure and chaste woman is thus deprived in the most cruel and brutal manner of the fruit of all her hopes and dreams of happiness. Similarly, a young man may find himself hopelessly condemned to a short life of pain and misery. He may also suffer from the knowledge that he has ruined the lives of those dearest to him. Venereal disease, syphilis in particular, emphasizes the practical value of continence, quite aside from its moral one, in a manner which cannot be ignored.